Hello and welcome back to class. We only have two more videos remaining to focus on the Presidents of the United States. Today we will go over Harry S. Truman, Dwight D Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard M. Nixon, and Gerald R. Ford. This will bring us through to a time period that many Americans can remember during their lives. These are the men that brought us through the Cold War and into the modern world as we know it. Our first president for the day is Harry S. Truman, who was the 33rd president and took over after FDR's sudden death in 1945. He implemented the Marshall Plan to help rebuild war-torn Europe. The Marshall Plan transferred $12 billion to Europe for economic recovery. Probably the most notable event during Truman's presidency, at least for his first term, was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, successfully ending the Second World War. Truman was alerted in July of 1945 that the atom bombs were ready to go, and in August he authorized their use. It was clear that traditional bombing was not going to get the Japanese to surrender. Ground invasions estimated as many as 200,000 American deaths. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the world's first atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima. Truman's second term was focused on the Red Scare and the rising conflict with the Soviet Union, our former allies during World War II. Truman supported and led the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1950, Truman knew he had to enter into the Korean War on the side of the South Koreans to contain the spread of communism throughout Asia. This is the start of the containment theory in practice that leads to the entrance of America into the Vietnam conflict in later years. Truman made the decision not to run for a second term, and in 1952, our next president took over. Our 34th president was the former Supreme Allied Commander of the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. His name was Dwight D Eisenhower. The D stands for David. However, he was most well known as Ike. Although Eisenhower was known for his military career and international diplomacy, he never did see active combat in World War II. He trained soldiers and was deeply involved in the planning of the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Italy. He became Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Western Europe in 1943 and planned the Normandy invasion and the conduct of the war in Western Europe until the German surrender. On the home front, Eisenhower authorized the startup of NASA after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, effectively starting the space race. He continued New Deal programs and expanded Social Security. He also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and sent Army troops to enforce the desegregation of schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. His two terms saw economic prosperity. His biggest project was the interstate highway system. Probably one of our most well-known presidents is next. That is John F. Kennedy, the 35th president and the youngest president ever at age 43. He was also the wealthiest up to his time, and most astonishingly for the time, a Catholic. He was only in office for 1,036 days before being assassinated in Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was a sickly child and continued to battle Addison's disease throughout his adult life, although the American public did not know about his illness. He managed to serve in the Navy because his father convinced the Navy to accept a false certificate of health. It is his service in the Navy that leads JFK to become a war hero after his torpedo patrol ship was sunk. He swam over 2 miles to find land and help for his men that survived the sinking. He and his men survived on coconuts and water for 6 days before being rescued. As President Kennedy faced a number of foreign crises, primarily dealing with the Soviet Union and the spreading of communism, there was the Bay of Pigs disaster in Cuba, where JFK allowed Cuban rebels recruited by the U.S. but without U.S. assistance to invade the island. Although the plan had been okayed by former President Eisenhower, its failure so early into JFK's term brought doubts about the young president's ability. One of the most harrowing times in the U.S. history was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where for 15 days in October 1962, JFK and Khrushchev pissed off over the island of Cuba, where the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles. These missiles could reach the continental U.S. JFK placed a naval blockade to prevent the Soviets from finishing the missiles. Using backdoor communications, JFK and Khrushchev were able to come to an agreement. The Soviets would take the missiles out of Cuba if USA would remove their missiles from Turkey. JFK's wife Jackie Kennedy became a style icon and brought small children to the White House for the first time in a while. She was a huge asset politically to JFK and remodeled the White House during his term. Kennedy spent his life cheating death but finally lost to a sniper in Dallas, Texas, 1963. I would be remiss not to mention Kennedy's assassination. However, this is one of the most notorious and conspiracy-driven stories in all of American history. I'll stick with the broad facts. Kennedy arrived in Dallas on November 22, 1963, with his wife, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president. Shots rang out while the presidential limo drove through Dealey Plaza. The Secret Service got him to Parkland Hospital, but the doctors were unable to save him. Jackie Kennedy was by her husband's side at the time and stood by Lyndon B. Johnson after he was sworn in only hours later. The shooter was determined to be Lee Harvey Oswald, who never made it to trial due to being shot to death himself only days later. Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office on the plane in Dallas, Texas, only hours after JFK's assassination. He quickly took up the civil rights torch that JFK had started, with his brother's urging. Johnson was a Southerner who disagreed with the idea of segregation of the races. While finishing Kennedy's term, Johnson was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He then strengthened civil rights with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was known for giving people the Johnson treatment, where he would use his considerable height and crowd the person who disagreed with him. He was big and was known for a sharp tongue and more than occasional cursing. LBJ declared war on poverty and enacted legislation to expand civil rights, public broadcasting, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, and the arts. He escalated the United States' involvement in Vietnam. This led to an increase in anti-war sentiment and protests throughout the country. The decline in his popularity led Johnson not to seek re-election. Our 37th president was Richard M. Nixon, who had lost out on the presidency when he ran against JFK in 1960 as the sitting vice president. This comeback also led to the only time in American history that a sitting president resigned the office. Nixon resigned his office during his second term due to the scrutiny of the Watergate break-in and cover-up. It was during President Nixon's term that America finally reached the moon in 1969, completing the challenge established by JFK. President Nixon remains the only president to have this event happen during his term. Nixon visited China in 1972, opening up business and diplomatic relations with the country. A year later, he ended the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and ended the draft. Nixon was re-elected in the largest electoral landslide in 1972. In fact, he won 49 out of 50 states. He created the Environmental Protection Agency by executive order, which led to the passage of the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and Endangered Species Act. However, most of this is overshadowed by the Watergate scandal and eventual resignation of our 37th president. After his resignation, Vice President Gerald R. Ford became the 38th president. He would pardon Nixon so that he could not be prosecuted for any crimes he may have committed while in office. This was an amazing sequence of events, as Ford had not been elected as vice president, but chosen by Nixon using the 25th Amendment and confirmed by the Senate and the House after Nixon's former vice president resigned. Ford was the subject of 2 assassination attempts, both done by women. On September 5th, the Secret Service apprehended Lynette Squeaky Frome, a former follower of Charles Manson, after seeing her with a pistol at a crowded event in Capitol Park. Barely 2 weeks later, radical activist Sarah Jane Moore fired a gun at the president in San Francisco, missing after her hand was pushed by a Marine who happened to be nearby. His wife was a former model and months before his inauguration had been diagnosed with breast cancer. She also lobbied for women's rights and 2 years after leaving the White House admitted to an alcohol and drug problem. She helped fund the Betty Ford Clinic and spoke about her challenges with addiction. She became Woman of the Year in 1975. During a short term, Ford faced economic hardships and an energy crisis. Ford vetoed 66 pieces of legislation, citing fiscal conservatism. On the international stage, Ford did help reduce tensions with the Soviet Union by signing the Helsinki Accords. Ford would not succeed in winning his own term in office, citing his pardon of former President Nixon as the most likely reason. Thank you for joining me today as we got through these more modern presidents. I hope you learned something new. I know I did. Please click like and subscribe. Don't forget to share. And as always, keep on learning. Thank you.